Welcome to the True Crime Glance. Today we're looking at the chilling case of the killing bunker of Vyatsky Polyani.
You know, this is really a story about injustice, but it comes in two parts. First, there's the unbelievable story of women who were enslaved by a killer in post-Soviet Russia. And then there's the second story of how, after they managed a courageous escape, they became victims all over again, this time at the hands of their own community. So we're going to walk through their desperate escape, the underground prison they were forced to endure, the town that showed them no pity, the justice that was eventually served, and then we'll tackle that really tough question. Why are victims so often the ones who are judged?
So, our story really kicks off with just a single moment of pure, raw desperation and incredible courage.
I want you to just picture the scene. It's a summer day, July 21st, 1997, on the edge of a small town in western Russia. And a young woman is just running. She keeps looking over her shoulder, terrified, and she's holding a small child, clutching them tightly to her chest. She finally makes it to a bus stop, gets on the very first bus that pulls up, and takes it right into the center of town. The second she gets off, she hurries straight into the local police station. Now, this woman's name is Irina Ganyushkina, and she's about to tell a story so completely unbelievable, it's going to be met with total and utter disbelief. She's brought before the chief of police, and Irina starts to recount an absolute nightmare. She tells him she's been held captive for 4 months in a secret bunker built underneath a garage. She was enslaved, she explained, forced to work as a tailor, just stitching clothes that were then sold at the local market. But the truly terrifying part is what she says next. She says, "I got out, but there are other women still trapped down there, prisoners of a man I call the Maniac."
In the police chief's reaction, he doesn't believe a word of it. He dismisses her completely. He actually threatens to have her committed to a psychiatric hospital, telling her she's been watching too many horror movies. But Irina doesn't back down. She is persistent. She refuses to be silenced, and she keeps repeating her story, adding specific details, even the names of other women who had gone missing. Her conviction is just so powerful that the police, even with all their skepticism, finally decide they have to at least look into it. But, not even Irina's harrowing story could have prepared them for what they were about to find. So the big question is, how on earth could a place like this even exist? To really get it, we've got to rewind a bit and take a look at the town itself and, of course, the man who built this fortress of horror.
So this all takes place in Vyatsky Polyani, about 800 kilometers east of Moscow. And like so many small Russian towns in the 90s, it was really struggling after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The whole local economy was pretty much propped up by the mullet gun factory, and when that went into decline, you had massive unemployment and poverty. It created this kind of environment where a predator could operate completely unnoticed.
And this is the environment where Aleksandr Komin lives, born right there in town in 1953. People described him as pretty unremarkable, but well-liked, a small guy with an engaging smile. But his life took a really dark turn when he was in his late teens. He did 3 years in a penal colony for hooliganism, and it was there he met another inmate. This inmate had been convicted of holding homeless people in his basement and forcing them into slave labor, and he talked about this feeling of unlimited power. And it was right there, in prison, that the seed for Komin's own monstrous plan was planted. After he got out, he worked odd jobs, but he wanted more. He started plotting to build an entire city, underground, filled with slaves who would work for him. So, with an accomplice, a security guard named Alexander Mikheyev, Komin started to dig. Underneath the building called Garage 198, on the outskirts of town, they dug a hole, 9 meters, straight down.
To try and put that into perspective, 9 meters is roughly the height of 2 double-decker buses stacked right on top of each other, and they dug the entire thing by hand. It was a secret project that took them 4 years to finish. By early 1995, Komin's underground prison was ready.
Okay, now we have to turn to the darkest part of this story. The lives of the women who were imprisoned in this bunker.
Komin's method, it was systematic and it was unbelievably cruel. He specifically targeted vulnerable women who were unemployed, maybe had minor criminal records, or were homeless. He did this because he believed, probably correctly, that society just wouldn't care if they went missing. He'd lure them to his property, drug them, and then imprison them in this tiny 15-square-meter bunker. And down there, they were forced to sew clothes for up to 16 hours a day. He would then take those clothes and sell them at the local market, getting richer and richer off their labor. His very first victim, a woman named Vera Talpeyova, was captured on January 13, 1995. And then, under threat of death, she was forced to help him find more women, including 2 local tailors, Tatiana Melnikova and Tatiana Kozykova.
And this, of course, brings us back to Irina Ganyushkina. In March of 1997, she accepted a drink from a neighbor, and she lost consciousness. The next thing she knew, she woke up in a filthy, windowless room with 3 bunk beds and sewing machines. She wasn't alone. 2 other women were there, just staring at her. And what she saw next revealed the absolute horror of the situation she was in, because tattooed on their foreheads, in this rough black ink, was a word. The Russian word rub. The meaning is completely unambiguous: slave. These women had been branded. Their identities were just stripped away and replaced with this one single horrific label. Komin had marked them as his property. Life in that bunker was a living hell. The women were subjected to constant beatings and terrible abuse. Early on, Melnikova and Kozykova actually made this desperate attempt to escape. They managed to overpower Komin and lock him in another room, but he broke out before they could get away. His punishment was savage. That's when he tattooed the word slave on their foreheads, and then he electrified the ladder, the only way in or out. After that, security got even tighter. Komin also murdered at least 2 women down there. Tatiana Nazimova, a homeless woman, was killed because Komin was paranoid she'd be able to identify him. And Vera Tolpayeva, his very first victim, was tortured for hours before being forced to take her own life. After Irina's escape and Komin's arrest, you'd think the nightmare would finally be over. But for the survivors, the escape was really just the beginning of a second, much more public ordeal.
The 2 remaining women, Melnikova and Kozykova, were rescued. They hadn't seen sunlight in over 2 years. The story was a media sensation. Their faces with those awful tattoos were broadcast all over local television. Authorities even opened up bank accounts to try and raise the $400 needed to get the tattoos removed. But then a really shocking public response started to unfold. After more than a month, not a single ruble had been donated. Instead of sympathy, the townspeople began to voice scorn and judgment.
The disconnect here is just staggering. On one side, you have the women's reality, years of trauma you can't even begin to imagine. On the other side, you have the town's judgment. The women's pasts, a divorce, a minor criminal record were used against them. People started calling them asocial. One hospital director even went on the record and claimed a normal woman would have either died or killed Komin, implying that their survival was somehow a character flaw. They were literally being blamed for their own suffering. And the impact of that judgment was just devastating. Irina, the very woman whose courage led to their rescue, was hounded by these questions. People demanded to know why she couldn't save the others sooner. She later said, "I feel as if I were the criminal." The very community she turned to for help had completely turned against her. So while the survivors were essentially being judged in the court of public opinion, their captor was finally facing actual justice. Komin's trial went on for 2 years, and throughout the whole thing, he was calm, showed absolutely no remorse. He even claimed that he had helped his victims, who he described as just homeless and unemployed women. In the end, he and his accomplice, Mahiv, were convicted of using slave labor, running a criminal enterprise, and the murder of 4 people. On June 11, 1999, Komin was sentenced to life in prison. His accomplice got 20 years. But Komin, well, he wouldn't serve his sentence. 5 days later, he committed suicide in his cell. But the story, it doesn't end there. In 2019, Mikheyev was released from prison. And in this incredibly cruel twist, he appeared on a Russian TV talk show. Irina was also brought onto the show and forced to sit directly opposite her former tormentor. The host then interrogated her, called her Komin's lover, and accused her of lying. Decades later, the public ordeal for her was still not over. So why did this happen? I mean, why was a community so quick to judge the survivors of such an obviously horrific crime? To try and understand this, let's turn to an expert's perspective. Human rights lawyer Dariana Graznova explains that this is tragically a global problem. It's rooted in a really damaging myth, the idea that if you are a good person, a good woman, then bad things just won't happen to you. And that leads to this dangerous conclusion that if something terrible does happen to a woman, well, she must have done something to deserve it. She must be a bad woman. And this is exactly what happened in Vyatsky Polyani. The survivors didn't fit this false, idealized image of a perfect victim, so they were blamed. The media coverage at the time really just reinforced all of this. The focus was overwhelmingly on the sensational, shocking details, the bunker, the tattoos, the systemic failures that allowed this to happen in the first place, and the actual support that the survivors needed were almost completely ignored. Gryazneva argues that it's just not enough to label a perpetrator like Komin a monster. That's almost too easy. It lets society off the hook. The truly important questions we should be asking are, why did this violence become possible? What were the societal gaps that allowed Komin to exploit vulnerable people for years? And what can be done to help survivors actually recover from something like this? The story of the women of Garage 198 is, without a doubt, a horrific tale of captivity. But it's also a profound lesson in how we, as a society, react to trauma. It forces us to confront a really difficult question, one that's still relevant today, far beyond this one small Russian town. When we hear a story of survival, what is our first instinct? Is it to question the choices and the character of the victim? Or is it to question the systems and the attitudes that failed to protect them in the first place?